tell me about Mary.
I think I'll start with the time I met her. I had heard of her, and I knew that she lived somewhere near Rene, Caisse, and that she used to come in and help her, but Rene never introduced her to anybody. So I had been very quiet about Essiac, sort of put it to rest for a while before the recipe was published by Gary Glum. Shortly before his book and his recipe came out, a dear friend of mine had terminal cancer of the bowel and the prostate, and I didn't know where to get Essiac because no one had the recipe. And so I sought out Mary McPherson's home, and I didn't introduce myself as Sheila Snow. I introduced myself as Sheila Napolitano because I didn't know what her feelings about me would be. Maybe I shouldn't be putting this on tape. Because I had never been introduced to her and she'd never been introduced to me.
Speak up a little.
So I knocked on the door, and Cliff McPherson answered the door and ushered me right into the living room. He was very friendly and welcoming, and I said I needed to get a bottle of Essiac, and was this the right place to be? He said, sure, just a minute, I'll introduce you to Mary Martha. That was her middle name. And in a couple of minutes, Mary came quietly into the living room, and I explained that, is there anywhere that I could get a bottle of Essiac for a friend of mine? And she went out to the kitchen, and she put a bottle in the bag and brought it back, and I gave her a donation. And I didn't stay long. They didn't ask any questions about me, and I didn't ask any questions about them. I just said that I believed in it, but I just simply didn't know where to get it. So after that, I came back a few weeks later for some more, and I got to know her a bit more. We talked, we chatted. Still didn't say my name, but one day I took her to the bank. She asked if I would drive her over to the bank, and we sat and talked in the car, and I told her who I was. And from then on, we just started to get to know each other, and the trust grew, and things weren't being published at that time. In other words, Gary had written the book, but it still wasn't known very much at that time. But when he came to Canada, to Bracebridge in 1989, then things started to become more known. There were articles and different things about that. And of course, once I had the information from his video, I was able to do my study on the herbs. So over the years, we've met very regularly, and we have a trust and a love between us. And I watched her quietly going about people, phoning people, asking all kinds of information, just as I did from her. Although I knew a fair amount, we could share the information and go through things and our memories of Rene, which was very comforting, I think, for Mary as well as myself. And I took notes. I began to take notes of her life and how she grew up, and we would see articles that would hurt her. And one was one that I happened to bring home from the States that somebody gave me. I was having a talk with someone down there, and they said, read Tom Valentine's article, just a minute, we'll photocopy it. He put out a magazine, and this was all about Essiac, and all the confusion, and Gary Glum's information, and contradictions, and all kinds of things. But in it, he referred to Mary. He interviewed her by phone. I believe he had a radio station as well as a magazine. He interviewed her by phone and talked about her, but didn't make her sound important or anything. Just sort of brushed by her, like, again, she was more or less in the background. I should pull out that article for you. And then later on, when Elena Alexander and the Flora Company produced a product called Fluorescence, she began to talk about Rene Caisse and lecture all over both the States and Canada. And she referred to Mary, she referred to Mary as a servant type, that Rene certainly wouldn't have left the recipe with her. And somebody brought that article into her, and she was very crushed. To see herself as a servant. And the town doesn't pay attention to her, really. They have honored her. They sort of included her when a plaque was put up for Rene Caisse. And I think they included her when they put up the name, the Rene Caisse Lane. But in any other way, they have more or less ignored her. They've come to her for help, different people, and even the town clerk came and talked with her and so on. But she was never really honored. And when the valuable things of Rene's were turned over to the Historical Society with the hope that there'd be more than a room, but a really nice display somewhere, she was never mentioned. Mary was never mentioned. And that's part of the whole story of Rene, because Mary met her way back in the 30s when her mother had cancer, and took her mother to meet Rene, and her mother was kind of reluctant to meet her. I'm not talking about that. I'm sorry. Hard to do a monologue because all right.
It's okay. Keep going. You're doing fine.
Her mother really didn't want to meet Rene.
Why?
Because she said she wasn't sure that she believed in that Essiac. And Mary said, well, I want you to come to her anyway. So she did, and she got her first treatment. And she had an injection. And she had a reaction to that injection. And it caused her to shiver. But that was the only injection she ever had. And then she took the oral drink, and when she went weekly for her treatment, it was just an oral drink. But there were times when Mary would pick up a bottle for her, because they had the doctor's written diagnosis. It was all on file. This was a legitimate patient. So she, and I asked Mary recently, I said, well, did she give you a pint-sized bottle, 16 ounces, like people are making today? She said, no, any brown bottle that she could find. It could be 2 ounces, 4 ounces, 8 ounces, or anything. Whatever people brought back to her, she sterilized and used. That's all she could do, because they weren't available easily at drugstores at that time for people to use. They were just for pharmaceutical use. That amused me. That came up recently. So her mother got well. She, I won't go through her case history because I don't think that's appropriate right now. And then I think it was Mary who developed cancer of the uterus before Cliff developed his cancer of the prostate. And it wasn't proven that it was cancer, but there was definitely a tumor. And she said they never wrote out a diagnosis, because at that point, this was in the 40s, and they weren't giving diagnosis. So she said, I really can't prove it, but I was told verbally that I had cancer of the uterus. And I think she had a hysterectomy for that. And when she was given an injection by Rene, it was right in the groin, which was very, very painful. Very painful. And that was the only one she had. And she became well, taking the Essiac for a certain length of time, and never had a recurrence of cancer. So she began to when her mother was involved, Mary began to collect names for the petitions, because she knew that her mother was being helped, and she had been listening to Rene and got to know her, and she wanted to support her cause. And the one she did the most work for was the one that had the most names, which was presented in 1938, which Rene claims to have 55,000 signatures. Now that's a lot of signatures in that day and age when you consider the population of Canada. And a lot of what they did was people would mail out the petition to patients who'd come from some other part of Canada or the States, and most people would sign it. And it still made no impression on the government, but that's Mary and her mother put a lot of work into gathering names. I don't think she became involved with the recipe and helping Rene until shortly before she retired from working at the local hospital. She worked in the kitchen of the local hospital. And in the late 60s, she knew Rene quite well and would drop in to see her sometimes. But when she retired, then Rene asked her to come over regularly, and that would be in 1969 she retired. Mary did. And her husband Cliff was working nights as a maintenance man or a security man at one of the places in Bracebridge. And so he would go off for the evening, but he'd drop Mary off to stay with Rene. And many times they would just talk about all the history of Essiac and all the dreams Rene had had and all the pain she'd gone through. And if anybody came to visit Rene in the evening, Rene would have Mary go into the kitchen to listen, but not to be present in the living room. Because if anybody wanted to wander through the house, they couldn't get beyond the kitchen. Mary would be there, you see. And it got much more hectic. She may have been in the kitchen when I was there with Rene. I would have no idea. And I would never inquire, and I was never curious. I never went wandering anywhere in the house. If Rene asked me to get something, I'd go and get it, but that was it. So after the magazine was published, it was hectic. And people from everywhere would turn up at Rene's, including doctors and the health department and various people. And she'd never know when they were coming, but she'd give Mary a call and say, "Get over here." Mary would always get over there and be on guard. So gradually, too, in those early 70s, Rene was older, and she trusted Mary enough to put the decoction together. Like Rene would dump the herbs in, but Mary would do the rest of it. And she would stay there till the steeping was done, and then she'd come back the next morning and bottle the decoctions and then go to work. That's when she first started. Or then when she retired, then she would go home. But she would come every morning to take that load off Rene. And of course no one knew she was doing it. And she saw various little packages of herbs, but she never asked questions. And when she saw some herbs mixed, she said they really were a beige color. So she knew that there was burdock somewhere around the way, because it had been delivered in 25 pounds at a time, things like this. So she said, well, you can tell that there's something like that, and that must be burdock in the recipe. She guessed at some of these things, but she really didn't know the whole thing. She had no idea about the sheep sorrel. And I think she could have known about the rhubarb. She might have not the amount, but that it was in it. So she had her own thoughts and her own observations. And she's a very important witness to Rene's life, and nobody has really recognized that. She was there at a very critical moment when Rene answered the phone in 1978, and it was Dr. Bush. And she asked him, Dr. Charles, would you like the recipe now? Now that could have been in 1977. I have a feeling. Check with Mary about that. It may have been 1977, about the time they were signing the Resprin thing, because she said, do you want the recipe now? Because she knew that he was going to set up a foundation for it. He said, no, it's not the right time yet. And Mary was witness to that telephone conversation. So that's very, very important. And it's too bad that he didn't have it, just for safety's sake, to back up anything if Resprin went down the tubes. So after Rene died, much to Mary's dismay, when she died suddenly after her accident with the broken hip, Mary, there were patients that needed this, and Mary had to guess at what it would be. I think there was mixture of Rene's left that she could go on with for a while. But there was the little girl with the brain tumor, Hope Stanner, and there were several others. A woman by the name of Pat Judson in Detroit. She was receiving it for breast cancer, and she had taken a diagnosis to her, and both had written diagnoses, so Rene was allowed to do this. She'd never been banned, and there were a list of people that were depending on her. And in one case, one man was only taking half an ounce a day, so he didn't use it too quickly, and Hope Stanner was only taking it by the teaspoon. And if Rene ran out of the herbs, she would add water to it. So Mary knew that if she ran short, she could add water and boil the herbs again and have something that would help people. But she certainly put something together for a while there that helped people. They all got well, much to her great relief. And she also did another very important thing. People don't realize how important those kidney pills are that Rene had patented and put on the market back in 1942. Because they helped the kidney and healed prostate problems, but she just thought it was just sort of like a casual remedy. It wasn't important. She didn't feel it did something special for cancer, but I believe it did, and I think Mary believed that it did. And the government refused to let these pills be produced again, and all the pharmaceutical companies that Mary wrote personally to for Rene rejected their request. So after Rene died, Mary, who had taken a herbology course and had passed her exams, decided to put this thing together in a capsule form. And she had studied Dr. Christopher's work, and she studied her course carefully, and she worked out what 5.5 grains would be in a tablet to what it would be in a capsule. And she was able to get the ingredients from an American company, and she mixed all the stuff up and put them in the capsules herself. She did all this work herself, and men who heard about it, men who had been taking the pill earlier, came to her door, and other new people, and they are still coming to her door today because it's helping people. So that was extremely important. She carried on that work. Now, Resprin had started to make the product, and it was not right. The patients were terrified. The taste was awful. They were now in plastic bottles, which had a plastic flavor. I sampled one myself, and it was dreadful. Dreadful stuff. It had no relationship to what Essiac should taste like. So Dr. Diamond, who was assigned to make this, was making it his own kitchen in Port Perry, Ontario, came up to Mary and said, "Would you please make our decoctions for a while?" So she made them for at least a year, possibly 2 years for them, until they got going and understood it. And if it weren't for Mary, I think that Essiac would have just disappeared. I really believe that Resprin didn't follow through, the trials didn't get off the ground, the studies were condemned, and I think everybody would have given up. If it hadn't been for Mary, I think everybody would have given up. Because she was the only person they could turn to for validity. And the recipe is we're still unsure of I don't think there was any one exact recipe. I think when Rene had to write that for Resprin, she said, "How will I put this down?" And it's probably the first time that she'd ever done it. She may at one time have put the 4 herbs and how much were in them into a vault, or she said that she had it entrusted to someone eventually should she die, but that didn't turn out to be the case when her will was read. But I think that to have to put down the steps is not an easy thing to do. And I'm not sure that she did put down the steps, because I've seen one recipe that told you what was in them. but it didn't give the process of how to prepare it. So I really think it was Mary who taught them step by step, eventually, how to do it. Because Rene was not invited to participate with Respite. They didn't share things with her. And she was more or less cut off. So Mary has carried on this, the spirit of it. She's spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people. What she did was people kept coming to the door over the 80s, and she kept a record of everybody who was coming and how much they got of the Essiac. This would be confidential. She was terrified that the government would step in. It was all done very, very low key. She only took donations. But there were a number of people who came, and she always kept a fastidious record on a calendar of who came and how much she gave them. So I feel that she's the mentor. She carried on Rene's work, believes in her completely. She arranged for her birthday party and did all the work because they were going to have a little committee here and a little committee there. She said, nonsense. I'll make some sandwiches and things, and other people will, and we'll make the cake, and we'll do this, and we'll have the community hall, and I'll do her hair. And it was really her orchestration, and it turned out beautifully for them. So Mary is very, very important here, and she always will be, and she needs to be recognized. The Historical Society really does not want to recognize her, and somehow this must be brought out to the world.
And what's Mary's life like now?
Well, in one way it's very lonely because her husband died 4 years ago. But in another way, it's very rewarding because people are so grateful to be able to talk to her and have their fears removed, or at least have an opinion as to their condition. And if they come to visit her, she can show them pictures of Rene and different things and what the plants are like, and take them out in the garden and so on. But she has so many calls and so many requests that she does get weary, and people are not sensitive enough to know that they can only take a little bit of energy. She doesn't have a lot of energy now to give. But I know that it's Essiac that keeps her going. Keeps her alive, keeps her fired up. And we have our little conversations every week, 1, 2, 3 times, depending on how much time we have together. And there's always something we can discuss about this, and she loves it. She looks forward to it. And because we can talk at a different level than she can talk to patients who are hearing about it for the first time. She doesn't have to go over the same thing over and over again. And she's got a great sense of humor, and she grew up on the farm. Her mother was a practical nurse, so she picked up all kinds of little techniques and things, and she has many interesting stories to tell. She used to pump the gas. They had a little gas station, a grocery store, she and her mother, because her mother was widowed at an early age, and she's just a wise country woman with lots of intelligence, which people don't even think about. Very special person.